Good morning, or good afternoon, and welcome everybody to our webinar on how to raise a citizen. My name is Gregg Nunziata, and I am the Executive Director of the Society for the Rule of Law, which is hosting this program today. Really looking forward to this conversation, which I think we could all take a lot from. But first, just a few announcements about us and the program for today. So, the Society for the Rule of Law is a membership organization primarily made up of conservative and libertarian lawyers, though we welcome others. If you are already a member, thank you for joining. Our membership is what makes this programming possible. If you are not a member, we encourage you to join. You can go to our website. There will be a link in the chat that you can use to join our ranks. And we have membership at various levels for lawyers, non-lawyers, students, and others. Please consider joining. Our sort of animating purpose is the prioritizing the defense and the preservation of the Constitution, the rule of law, and American democracies, and putting that before more narrow concerns of personality or politics or policy. And we do that in a range of ways. One of the ways we advance our mission is by hosting programs like this, both online and in person. Our next virtual event will be our next announced virtual, our next scheduled virtual event will be December 10th with our charter member, Yale Law School professor Keith Whittington, who has a new book coming out this month on the impeachment power, which will be an interesting conversation just coming up on the inauguration of the next president. We don't have a link up for that yet, but keep an eye on our website. It will be up soon. Our next in-person event will be our annual Rule of Law Summit, and that's going to occur here in Washington, D.C. on November 13th. We can also drop a link for that on the registration information from our website. Now, for today's programming, a few things to know. We will be inviting audience questions, and you can drop your questions in the chat function of the webinar at any time, and I will go through them and pose them to our guest throughout our conversation. The other thing to know is that this will be recorded. So if you have to duck out or if you know somebody who missed it live, you should be able to watch it on our YouTube channel. These programs are usually posted the same day of the conversation or soon after. So keep an eye out for that. With all those preliminaries out of the way, I would like to welcome our guest today. Lindsey Cormack is a professor of political science and director of the Diplomacy Lab at the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. Her new book is called How to Raise a Citizen and Why It's Up to You to Do It. It's available on Amazon and wherever else you purchase your books. Give it a look. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Lindsey, who can tell us a bit about this book and how she came to write it. And then we will have a conversation. Thank you so much for being with us today, Lindsey.
Thank you so much for having me, Greg. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and for everyone else who's here doing all the Society for the Rule of Law programming. I'm going to go ahead and jump into a little presentation so you guys can understand where I'm coming from, how this sort of work came together, and then whatever questions you have, nothing's off limits. I'm always happy to do it. One of the best things about being a professor is the Q&A portion. And so when we get there, I'm really looking forward to it. Let's go ahead and jump in though, so that you can kind of see how this work has originated and what it looks like today. Can everyone see this? Okay.
Looks good.
All right. So every time I give some sort of version of this talk, I like to sort of tell people who I am because a lot of times it's people who I've never met before. I'll tell you something that I did last year was I was on sabbatical for the whole academic semester, actually the whole academic year. And I got to do a lot of really strange things, but it was really interesting because I got to know politics in ways that I hadn't known before. So what you're seeing here in this picture is this little poster board that I had, and I'd go around New York City with two chairs and a table and a sand timer, and I'd ask people, will you chat with me about politics for 3 minutes? And it just allowed people to say to me whatever sort of questions they had, whatever sort of thoughts they had. And it was a really nice contrast with the way that I normally know politics, which is through a very academic, numbers-based, data-driven assessment style. And this was one where I got to know people in a one-on-one individual style. I'm at Stevens Institute of Technology, which is a premier engineering university in Hoboken, New Jersey. I've been there for 10 years. And one of the reasons that I wrote this book is I am with great students every day. I have students who are really good at doing school. They know how to take tests. They go on to bright careers, but they oftentimes do not know the very basics of government. They don't know the contours, they don't know the levers of power, they don't know the players. And when they lack those basics, they get disinterested, they get apathetic, and they just get frustrated with the system, which is not something that I want for them or really that I want for any of our young people who are eligible to participate. The first academic project that I did was this thing called DC Inbox, and that's freely available. Anyone can go use it. And what it is every member of Congress gets to send emails to their constituents in their official capacity where they say, hey, here's the votes that I took, or here's the chair position that I have in a different committee. And I really thought that because these were taxpayer funded, created communications conditionally done by officials in their official capacity, we should have access to them. They should be something that we have an archive, that we have a database of. So in 2009, I started this project. It has every member of the House, every member of the Senate. It grows every day. There's over 200,000 emails in the database, and it's open and searchable to anyone to see what they think their member is talking about, or you can see how a bunch of different members are talking about different subjects. The first book that I ever wrote was Congress and U.S. Veterans, from the GI Bill to the VA crisis. And while I liked the practice of this book, and while I really liked the results of this book, the one that I'm going to talk about to you today is my favorite thing that I've ever done. It's my labor of love, but it's also sort of a love letter to the next generation of citizens who I know want to have their politics feel and function better. Finally, another way that I know politics is through very local doing. I'm an appointed member of Community Board 8 in Manhattan, which is the most local form of government doing things like zoning, landmarks, liquor licenses, recreational cannabis licenses, schools, libraries, senior centers. We do all sorts of things at the very first stop. And so it's just another way that I sort of understand our politics. So I always like to start with this slide because what I'm going to tell you today is that the way that civic education happens in the United States, there's no one answer. We don't have one sort of universal program for like, here's what all of our kids should know by the time they graduate from high school. Instead, because of our federalist system, we have at least 50 different civic approaches to learning. And really, when we look at the different states, oftentimes they devolve this power down to different school districts. And within school district, they devolve it down to schools. And so you can't really get a handle on what's happening across the United States in any one cut. And the way that we did the research for this book, we looked at assessments at 8th grade, assessments at 12th grade, and we had interviews with teachers in nearly every school, or nearly every state, excuse me. But you'll see that there's a variety. Sometimes you have a semester-long class, sometimes you have a year-long class, sometimes you're going to have a test at the end, sometimes you're not. But here's sort of the broad strokes as to how we teach civics, government, politics in the United States. On average, students are introduced to their first sort of social studies course in their 7th or 8th grade. Sometimes it's called U.S. history, sometimes it's called world history, but it's this umbrella sort of thing where they learn about maybe the founders, they might learn about westward expansion, but that's usually the first touch. And then again in 12th grade, we check in the second semester of the senior year of high school, and typically students will get a class called government. This is unlike every other subject in the United States where we start in K and we layer in scaffold all the way through 12. For most of the students throughout the US, they dip in at 7th or 8th grade and then they get another touch point in their 12th grade. And I don't know what you were like in your second semester of your senior year of high school, but I do know what I was like, which was not very receptive to learning a bunch of new things, especially really important things. My mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about college, thinking about moving out, what was going to be next. And so the sort of approach that we do it is too little, too late, and not really an optimal timing for our kids to understand what it is they need to know about government. What you're looking at here is the nation's report cards assessment for the civics assessments that's administered in 8th grade. This is a test that's administered in rich schools and poor schools, in urban and rural suburban settings, and across all different demographic variables. And what you're seeing are the different lines, as if we had advanced achievement would be the green lines, proficient achievement would be the yellow line, and that red line would be basic achievement. This blue thing that's going through from 1998 to today shows that we really aren't doing any better in the way that we're preparing our 8th graders to understand civics. If you sum all these things together, only 23% of US 8th graders are considered proficient in civics. So we know at that first pass, we're really not doing enough. When we look at 12th grade, it's very hard to make an assessment of everyone because there is no national standardized civics test. Instead, the best that we can do is look at advanced placement scores. So we know that there's been between 38 and 40 AP tests administered every year. And what you're seeing here is in 2019, the average scores around the United States for different exams. AP US Government and Politics is towards the bottom, and on average, our students don't earn a 3, which is what you need as a minimum to get college credit. Now, why this is an indicator that we're not doing that well is only 2% of US high school students take AP US Government. And these are typically the ones who think they're good at it, they have a taste for this, or it's going to be an easy A. But they get this harsh reality, which is compared to many other subjects that we test on, we tend to do very bad on this one, despite the fact that nearly every student who takes this exam is going to go on and live the rest of their life as a US citizen in the US government having to do with the US political system. These are the rankings from last year in 2023. And you'll notice if you look at the bottom right, AP US Government is the second to lowest AP pass score. So here again, most of our students do not earn a 3, which means they're not going to get any college credit for it. We have these other indicators that our young people simply don't know how to participate in politics. And one of the easiest ways to think about it is turning out to vote. Now, this is conditioned on being registered, but if I were to show you that, you'd see the same thing, where our youngest people are the least likely to register. And when we look at our last federal election, the midterms in 2022, fewer than 25% of our college age students, these 18 to 24-year-olds, were participating to vote regularly. This means that our politics can't reflect them, but it also means that they don't feel good about our politics and government because they see that they aren't participating in it. I have college students every day in my line of work, and oftentimes they'll say something like, "Why is everyone in politics so old?" And I'll be like, "I don't know, you guys, we're in a representative democracy. And if you look at who's turning out, it kind of represents those people." And so I know it's something that frustrates them. It doesn't feel fair. It's not how it's meant to work, but it doesn't seem that there's a clear way to get out of it. We also know that when we're looking at early voting right now in this federal election, our youngest people are the least likely to do it. Now, I've been pressing my college students on this. I'm like, what's happening? And some of them are telling me, I want to vote on election day. I want to vote on Tuesday because it's my first time and I want to see what that's like. Fine. But I do not have high hopes that in 2024, we're going to have youth voter turnout that beats what it was in 2020. Now, I know it's been increasing year over year, but there's a few things that aren't in place this time that make me hesitant. We know that in 2020, most of our college age students were back at home. We also know that voting is contagious, and if you have parents who are doing it, you're more likely to do it. We also know that mail-in balloting is not as ubiquitous as it was in 2020 because we're no longer in a pandemic. So I fear that our young people are not going to reach the turnout levels that they had last time, despite the hype that we're hearing around them this time. So there's a few different ways that we got to this civic deficit. One of them is it's hard. Our government is hard to understand. There's different layers, there's different players, there's things you have to think about historical, contemporary, future things. So it's difficult. The idea that we could teach our students everything they need to know in 1 year in 7th and 8th grade and then a semester in high school just doesn't make sense. We also, in different parts of the country, have a tradition of not talking. I was raised in Kansas and I moved to New York when I was 22. In Kansas and in many parts of the Midwest and the South, there remains a taboo around talking about politics. It kind of sits in a taboo bucket with things like sex or drugs or money. When this happens, our people, our students, our young people, they do not have an ability to engage because they really just don't understand the practice of how to do so. When you look at other places that do tend to have more of a tradition about talking about politics, they oftentimes hate politics. And what I mean by that is our young people are exposed to narratives like, everyone in it is an egomaniac, they're all liars, the system is rigged, they're in it for themselves. If that's the message that they're getting, it's not surprising that they don't want to opt in and learn more. And this is true even if we aren't telling our own children these stories. When you look at children's literature and children's media, there's oftentimes some sort of mayor character or a government figure. And at best, that person is a bumbling doofus who gets it together, but barely. And at worst, they're out to do harm, like the mayor in The Simpsons, where they're a slick character trying to harm the city that they're meant to protect. So they get this narrative that politics is very negative. And finally, the big thrust of this book is that our schools really aren't up to the task right now. And I'm going to go through the reasons why. One is that we have some sort of challenges in different parts of the country about when state legislatures will say when you can talk about these sorts of things, off limits topics, framing that you can use, and then limiting the amount of curricular time that you can do to civics. Something that we saw in Texas was sort of the elimination of what's known as action civics, which is when you have groups of students try to figure out something in their community and say, you know what, I want to figure out how I can make it better. Who do I contact? Because students were contacting elected officials, appointed officials, the state legislature in Texas was uncomfortable with this and said, we're no longer going to have this sort of action civics. And so that's not a way to teach it in Texas. And instead, politics, government becomes something that's sort of theoretical or historical, and students see themselves as spectators, not necessarily as active participants. We also know that throughout the United States, our obsession with the SAT and the ACT means that it's very hard in a crowded curricular space to put in civics, politics, government, because that's not tested in either one of these assessments. This isn't just true that these assessments are something that matters for students, but they also matter for schools. Because when we think about schools that are designated as blue ribbon schools or eligible for more grant funding, oftentimes it's those who can prove to test results. With the ACT and the SAT not having any component of civics, it's not surprising that teachers say, you know what, in a crowded day, when I have to get something that gives them an outcome that's going to be good for them and good for the school, civics, social studies, it's what's going to get squeezed out. There's also a series of court cases that I go through in the book that have limited the way that teachers sort of freely talk about these things in their classroom. And we also know that if we just look at the dollars and cents on this, for every $50 that's spent on STEM in our K through 12 system, only 5 cents goes to civics. I work at a STEM university. I understand the power of STEM, but the counterbalance just doesn't make sense if we're making these products for people who don't understand the systems that they're going to be a part of. And finally, parents tend to be an issue in how to get this work done in schools. When we were interviewing teachers, something that we repeatedly heard is that while social studies teachers want to talk about subjects, they want to give good lessons to students, they're afraid that if they say something that a student hears and repeats to a parent in a way that's maybe ungenerous or maybe just a misunderstanding, they're going to have that parent email their principal, email themselves, inflame a Facebook group, and make their life harder. And so there's a lot of constraints to getting this stuff done in schools, which is why this became a book about how we can do this in our own homes and in our own communities. And that is where I can end this today, and then we can talk about what sorts of questions you all might have about the research or what's happened.
Thank you so much, Professor Cormack. This is great. I read the book. I really enjoyed it. It's well, it's timely because, well, for one, I mean, I just as a citizen and as someone who's spent a lot of my career working in politics, I've been increasingly kind of convinced that a lot of the dysfunction in our politics and our government flows from a weak understanding of our system and our Constitution amongst our people. So it's a huge problem. I also have two young children who I need to start talking to about the country and the government and thinking about how to go about that. So this book, it includes some sort of background on education and civics in our country, really practical ideas for how to talk to your children about these things, and a primer on concepts that folks might not be familiar with. So there's a lot packed into a couple hundred pages here, and I thank you for doing it, and thank you for joining us to talk about it today. I guess let's where I don't know where to even start, but there's so many things I want to ask you, but let's just talk about kind of big concepts. Um, what's a citizen, right? I mean, and is it the same thing as a voter?
Yeah, so I really like this question. And I understand that sometimes citizen can be like an exclusive legal definition for like who's entitled to something and who's not. That's not the way I conceive of it. And in the book, I talk about this in the introduction. I say that I view a citizen as someone with agency within a political system, someone who understands how to activate and use their own power. And citizenship in this context goes beyond formal political actions like voting or running for office. It's really more about being a member of a community, contributing to our shared life, and understanding the government apparatus in order to engage with it. So it's not, I get this or I don't get this because of my definition. We are all sort of citizens by virtue of being in a community.
And I think clearly, the founders, I think, expected that we'd have a responsible citizens. There's a John Adams quote, I think, about how the Constitution is designed for a moral and informed people, and it will suit no other. So I mean, it's clearly a problem if our people don't understand their roles and obligations and how to work within the system, how to make their desires felt within the community. But let's also, before we get further into that, let's look at the kind of in the other direction. It would clearly be better for our system to have more informed students, more informed, a more informed population. But why is it good, you think, for our kids themselves and maybe for our families to tackle this? Because I don't, you don't seem to, you don't argue that it's just for the good of the commonweal that we do this. You think there are upsides for parenting and for preparing our kids to go out into the world. So can you talk a little bit about that parenting lens?
Sure. So, as parents, we shape the way our kids dream. We are their biggest role models, no matter what. We have the most time with them, they have the most time with us. And so, if we can show them what it is to be an active participant in our society, if we can show them what it is to care about these things, what it is to learn more, what it is to vote and do sorts of things like that, then they see that as a value that they can emulate. So, that's just like good for everyone. But in terms of how it's good for us back and forth, there's plenty of reasons to believe that in engaging in this work with our kids, we make them more likely to be successful in their life because they're going to know how to advocate for themselves. We're more likely to make them mentally resilient and kind of lean on these non-cognitive skills of, ooh, you know what, I can grapple with hard things. I can sort of understand when there's ambiguity. I can go back and forth on things. I can be rooted in my understanding of our politics instead of afraid of what I maybe hear in the media. But we also know in the nuts and bolts of it, you make them more likely to be successful in college admittance if like they have some sort of history of either interning with an office, whether that's legislative or executive or judicial, or if they've done community work. It shows that they are pro-social, they are problem solvers, they go outside of their comfort zone, and they're willing to give back. So those are things that we can give to our kids as gifts: resiliency, levels of success, abilities to get into college. But in terms of what we can get ourselves, is we can get such a neat way to bond with our children, for them to know us and for them to know us and for us to know them. We can say like, ooh, let's grapple with some of these things together. And I guarantee you, when you do it with a child, it changes the way that you think about things, because adults, when we have political discussions, we come to this with our own sort of prejudicial, lived experience understanding of these concepts. Children don't. They come with this, like, I'm trying to make sense of the world. They have little proto versions of fairness. That's not usually the things that are ingrained in us. And so, in having those conversations, we can sort of understand our politics in a far more robust way.
How well do you think parents need to? But part of the premise here is that the public at large isn't very well formed in civics. So how well do parents need to know their civics to be able to be effective in raising children in this way?
Yeah, so part of this book is recognizing that it's not like a scolding or a finger waggy book that's like, you should know more. And really, our kids do not need us to be little government experts. What they need us to do is model what it is to try to learn more when you need to learn more, instead of just like digging in and feeling like you've got it all under control. They don't need us to have all the answers. They need us to be able to say, I don't know, let's go figure that out together. But I do recognize for most of the audience of this book, parents and grandparents and educators of today, they already went through school systems that were actively deprioritizing civics. That's been true from the 1940s to today. And so many of us do not feel like we have like a good well of knowledge to pull from. So the second half of the book is essentially a little primer that says, here's some very basic concepts. Here's some ways that you can think about federalism. Here's some ways that you can understand the Constitution a little bit better. And then when your kids kind of push you in a direction or ask you a question, you have a little bit of a stronger footing to go figure things out, and you can have a better conversation with them. But they don't need us to be experts. None of us are really ever going to be experts. There's always learning to do in this realm.
And how do you talk about this a bit in the book? How obviously children come to this at different ages and different developmental stages. When's a good time to get started with your kids in conversations about politics and civics?
So I sort of break it up into three age bands. 5 to 9 is these like young children. You're not quizzing them on the Constitution. They're not going to retain that. But if you've ever been around 5 to 9 year olds, you know that they do understand politics. They do understand fairness. They do understand sharing. They understand like petty legalese, like you can't touch me. Like they get this. And so, what I offer parents in that sort of realm or in that sort of age band is just don't shy away from showing them things. Take them to vote with you. Let them see those spaces. Humanize government instead of telling them, these people off in DC, maybe nefarious actors, you're never going to know them. It's like, no, most of our government is very knowable. State and local politicians are out there, your neighbors, they're your friends. And so it's letting them know that we are making these collective decisions together and showing them sort of the bright spots too. Because even at that young age, they're going to hear complaints on the media, they're going to hear complaints out in society. But if you have like a nice park, if you have good schools, clean drinking water, good roads, that's stuff you can say, oh, guess what? We all decided as a community to get together and do this. at 10 to 14, you can start building bigger concepts, which is how we do everything. You start with little vocab pieces, then you get to bigger concepts. Something that I really like for that age band is if you have an election coming up and you're maybe uncertain as to how you're going to vote, maybe not for the top of the ticket, but there's always down ballot races that we don't know a lot on. You can send your 14-year-old out and say, can you be our family researcher on this? Can you try to figure out what you would about these candidates? Maybe spend 10 minutes trying to look for this one, 10 minutes on that one. Tell me what you think. And that sort of builds a muscle memory for them of what it is to assess candidates, what it is to have competing claims. How do I go sift through this information? And then at 15 to 18, before your kids are getting ready to leave the house, there's 5 pieces that I argue that you have to do with them. And these pieces came together based on what we talk to teachers that's not taught and what we know, and by being on the other side of it and being with college students, what they don't know. And the first was they need to know how to register to vote. And this is something parents must help their kids with because in many states, they're going to have to navigate systems they're not used to. If you don't have an online voter registration system, like we don't in Texas and like they don't in a few other states, they're going to have to do something in the mail. And a lot of our young people never even know where stamps are. They don't know how to address envelopes. Not to mention that nearly every state, when you register to vote, you're going to have a social security number. And most of our young people don't know their social security number. They don't know where the card is. It's like in a folder that mom might have in a drawer. And so you just got to help them on that. The second thing is they need to understand the Constitution. They need to have read it at least once. It's the rule book. And I know we think we're going to get it done in schools. We don't. It's not something that you sit down and say, read these 19 pages right now. But in the course of a lifetime, hopefully you've had an opportunity to talk about the different powers. They need to understand federalism. That's something, where they can be mad that their school start time is too early, but the president's not going to fix that because that's not in his purview. And then they also need to understand the difference between primary and general elections. And one of the reasons I'm happy to be talking with you today is we really only get 4 or 5 presidential elections with our kids before they're out on their own, voting eligible adults. And so when we can talk to them about, this is a big election, but in so many of our places, primaries are where things actually happen to get your final outcome because the districts just aren't that competitive once you get to the general election. That sort of knowledge lets them not get alienated by a two-party system, lets them really understand where their power can be. And then the last thing, which is this all-encompassing thing, is they need to understand and practice having hard conversations. Because something that I see in the classroom is so many of our young people are afraid and under-practiced at being discomforted or discomforting others. And it's not to say that you try to inflict violence through words, but it is to say we're going to disagree on things. We have different starting points. We have different endpoints that we want to get to. We're going to go on different journeys. But we have to be able to have conversations with people who have different looks at things than we do. And a lot of our young people just don't because it doesn't happen in schools. And we've all been a bit afraid to take it on in our own homes when we talk about politics.
I mean, what do we do with the ugly tone that seems to be out in our politics, maybe more in the last few years than it had been historically? I mean, when you do have politicians or political actors speaking in apocalyptic terms or speaking in extremely negative terms about the other party, uh, do you contextualize that? Do you filter it? Do you try to block it out from your kids? Because the toxicity must turn some people off or malform people into radicals rather than responsible citizens. So how do you, as a parent, filter that?
Yeah, this is a really hard question. And I'll tell you, the way that I sort of come at it is as someone who's been reading communications directly from members of Congress to their constituents for the last 15 years. And it is true that at the federal level, we get really hyperbolic language. We get stuff that says, like, if this side wins, then we're never going to have a democracy again. Well, no, if this side wins, we're never going to have a democracy again. Those sorts of messages don't seem to be helpful. They're also not true. We have like a very strong system that's probably going to be able to withstand a lot of things that come against it. And that's sort of the beauty of what we're doing here. And I think what we need to do with our children is make sure that they're not just experiencing these things in a vacuum, but that they can have people to talk to about it, namely ourselves as their parents as the first stop. Because if we just lead them to like the vagaries of the internet, what they're going to see, it's going to be apocalyptic. It's going to be bad because that's what the internet sort of incentivizes and pushes around. And so I think something that we can do to really sort of center them or root them on this is let them know more about their local and state politics. Because oftentimes in those settings, you're not getting people who say like, oh, if we don't have this new thing that lets us zone this thing for a school, we're going to not have democracy anymore. So many of our small, quality of life things are more routine, not partisan, but they really take people thinking on things in a hard way to get like a different zoning outcome or to say that we're going to license this or not. And that might seem boring, but it's not really boring if it's something that's related to them. And this is why like people really like action civics because you let the kids figure out what it is that they want. Do they not have a basketball court they want to play on? Okay. Who do they have to talk to? Is that a city council question? Is there an appointed board? Is this the mayor's question? It's letting them sort of figure out these quality of life things as a way to counterbalance the bigger hyperbolic negative things that they're going to hear, especially when we look at federal politics.
Do you have a theory as to kind of why, if people only know a little bit about politics, it tends to be just about the federal government, the part of government that is furthest from them and maybe touches them the least? I mean, people seem to be wildly ignorant of their local government.
Well, part of that is most of our school curriculums don't talk about local government at all. Most of our school curriculums don't do state government. There are some big states like Texas will do Texas history. A lot of other states will like dip into their history a little bit, but nearly all of the ways that we teach politics is we teach here's the federal level, and then we sort of say, and then it's replicated somewhat in the state and local level. And so it's easy for me to understand why that's what we know because that's really all that we teach. And when we think about how we have a media environment that is increasingly bifurcated, increasingly cut up in ways that we don't really have local journalism like we had 30 years ago. It's not surprising to me that the stories that get pushed around the internet are mostly federal politics because that's sort of the coverage options that we have right now for most of us.
I was myself, I was a strange kid and I was a politically active kid, long before I was 18. So I recognize that and I like seeing young people engaging with their government and caring about politics. But you do sometimes see kids in the political arena that seem to be being used as props by their parents or adults in their lives. And that always makes me cringe a little bit. Uh, is that line clear? I mean, how do you think about that as a parent to get your kid active, but um, with some agency and not as simply a tool for your own passions or agenda?
I share that sort of trepidation where, I have a daughter myself. I have a 12-year-old. I'll take her to vote with me. If there was, a protest or a march that I wanted to go to, I might expose her to it. Would I take pictures of her and put it on the internet? Probably not, because I want her to be able to make those choices later on, whether she was there or not there, wanted to be associated or not. I think there is not an easy line for me to draw for this because it is true that children's lives are political. It's not, you turn 18 and then you matter in the system. Your lives matter before, and there's different policies that impact kids. But I am very hesitant to make them sort of say, here's my mom says this or my dad says this, and I just want to be with them. It's really hard. They have developing brains. They're not quite there yet. But I also do want to give them some agency. So I'll give you an example. My daughter was really unhappy that in her school they had plastic utensils. And I said, okay, well, let's think about how you could maybe change that. And her friends came up with a petition. And I was like, okay, so how are you going to show your school that, people care about this? She was like, we'll get them to sign. Okay. So they went around at lunch and had a bunch of kids sign and they submitted it to the administration. The administration was like, that's cute. And nothing happened. But she learned the process of organizing. She learned the process of fighting for something that she wanted. She also learned a valuable lesson in failure that oftentimes, when you get to a power level and there's an imbalance, you can't fix it. But I'm glad that she did that. And it was something she cared about, not something that I necessarily cared about.
Have you seen the research or what is the research on parents' ability to transmit their own political values or preferences to their children? Sometimes you think kids inherit it, but anecdotally, we know people who seem to react opposite or against their parents' politics. So is there a through line on this? Does the scholarship say anything in particular?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this. I get into this a little bit in my book because emerging research suggests that it's kind of a coin toss. So if you're like a Democrat trying to raise a little Democrat, a Republican trying to raise a little Democrat, a Republican, you'll get it about 50% of the time. And 50% of the time, you're either going to raise someone who's turned off to politics altogether because you've done a little bit too much pushing, or they're going to rebel and say, you know what, I actually prefer this other party. And what I talk about in the book is that raising a partisan is different than raising a citizen. And we should all try to be raising citizens, not partisans. And a way that you can kind of think about it is raising an athlete versus raising a spectator. So if you wanted to raise a really good soccer player, you would teach them the rules of the game, you would do scrimmages, you would have practice conditioning drills, and they'd be better at doing that sport. If you wanted to raise a really good fan, you might say, like, here's the colors that we paint on our face, here's the songs that we chant, here's the people that we really like who are good at playing this sport for our team in the past. But in politics, we are all athletes. We are not spectators. Even if we think we're sitting on the sidelines, what we're actually being is non-functional athletes because whoever tries harder, has greater attention, more practice, they're the ones who get the goals, the outcomes that they want. And so we should raise our kids to be citizens, knowing that they will be able to make the sort of spectator or fan choices that they want later in life. We know the parties change. We know the people change. We know ideology is fluid. And so we have to trust that if we give them the tools to understand the game, they can pick the team that they want to. And if they need to pick a different team at some point in their life, that's fine too. The best thing that we can give them is sort of an understanding of the ground rules, not necessarily which team they should root for.
Right. That's a really helpful metaphor. Thank you. I can ask you a million more questions, but we have a ton in the chat. So let me start trying to share some of the questions from our audience for you. Uh, One is a question which you do touch on in your book is about radicalization and when does that, at what age does that start with kids? When should you be looking out for it? How do you guard against it?
Yeah, so this is hard. This is sort of stuff that can kind of emerge when our children are individuating themselves from us. So this is like the later middle schools, the high school time. And it's sort of different for boys and girls. And we know that sort of like the pathways and the rabbit holes that they go down tend to be a little bit different. In the book, I have about 6 steps where I say the best thing that you can do if you suspect your child is being radicalized, or if you suspect they're trying to hold on to some views that you kind of think are extremist or maybe dangerous, the best thing you can do is let them know that that line of communication is open to you so that they're not having to just like sit online scrolling or in their bedroom trying to figure things out. If they say something, you should ask them, "Oh, what have you heard on that?" And let them sort of set the table with like the sorts of things that they're seeing and being exposed to, because I guarantee it's not going to be what you're exposed to. We all know we have like an algorithmic process that delivers us news, not the other way around. We're necessarily seeking it. And so the first thing is, keep that line of communication open. If you do have something where you're like, "Ooh, this seems concerning," instead of saying like, "Stop doing that," or "How could you believe that?" The better way to sort of work through them was with a calm demeanor, something like, "Oh, okay, so can you tell me how you take this to the next step, or what's the logical end here?" And then at that sixth point, it's, if you're afraid, if you think someone's in danger, if you think your child's in danger, you have to seek professional care. And I know that's hard, and I know our systems are difficult and sort of unwieldy, but no one wants to be the parent who opens up a newspaper, reads an alert on their phone that says like, something has happened in a school, or something has happened in some other building. And so I think the best thing that we can do is make sure that we have a open line of communication so we understand what our kids are getting into. And we know that that's something that sort of happens as soon as they individuate and tend to be on their phones in ways that we don't really supervise, which is that later middle school, high school age.
Thanks. We have a question from a grandmother who's helping homeschool her grandkids, and she wanted to know if you had any recommendations for age-appropriate curriculum or reading. Her kids are 6, 4, and 3, so young kids. Any books or structured curriculum out there that you would recommend?
Yeah, so Kathy, thank you for this question. On my website, which is howtoraiseacitizen.com, that final tab is resources, and I have different books that are suggested for different ages. And in this book, I have different ones, but I'll tell you one right now that I really like. PBS Kids has this show that is targeted towards that age, that 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way through 8, which is called City Island. And it's not just politics and government, but it's more about like what it is to be a part of community, what it comes to like, oh, we're gonna like build new roads, or guess what? We're gonna have some eminent domain, or guess what? Someone's feeling left out. How can we care for them in a better way? But it's all sort of created with this ethos of like communities take care of communities. There's different political actors in communities. Here's how you access them. I think that's a great sort of like visual resource because at that age, those kids aren't reading that much. But there's other things that are on my website, which is just again, howtoraiseacitizen.com.
Great, thank you. And we have a link to the website in the chat as well for folks. Um, we're mostly talking about how to raise kids at home, but we started off talking about civics and how the states approach it, and maybe some of how the federal government has nudged education. Uh, do you have policy solutions or recommendations that you think we ought to look at the federal level or at the state or local level to improve civics, or you really think it's all just up to families?
I don't think it's all up to families. I think if I could wave a magic wand, we'd have far more focus on this in schools. I just recognize that it's difficult to get that done because a lot of times people are afraid that a school might teach it in a way that they wouldn't want to teach it, but then they don't do it themselves. And so we just get this, sort of no one knows what's happening and everyone plays politics catch up until they're 45. And so if there was a way to change this in schools, my first ask would be that we don't just talk at seventh and eighth grade and then again at 12th. This should be something that's layered year over year. Idaho has a K through 12 program. Colorado has a K through 12 program. New York State in 2017, 2018 adopted a K through 12 program. But we can't say just because we're talking about this in schools means that we don't have to do anything in the home. I really think they're sort of synergistic and there's stuff that like if your kids can practice at home, then they're going to be better students in the classroom. They're going to be better peer role models to everyone else and going to be able to do that work. But if I could lobby for something, it would be year over year that we touch it every time and that we just need more funding for this. A joke that we heard repeatedly is when we were interviewing teachers, they're like, oh, you know who teaches AP US government? His name is Coach. And that's because in most of our school settings, the people who are employed as social studies teachers will not have a full-time employment contract unless they're doing other things in the schools like coaching wrestling or track or football or swimming. And so we need to have more of a prioritization, which is going to be money and it's going to be time that happens in schools.
That's, excellent. What about you're at a university? So we're mostly talking about K to 12 here, but have you given any thought to what role higher education has in civic formation?
I mean, higher education, depending on where you are, is a place where we have the 18-year-olds. So that's where, we'll do like voter registration stuff. But it's something where, in my understanding of this landscape in the higher ed space, is that oftentimes it's sort of a hot potato game of like, who's going to do this? Is this going to be the president's office? Is this going to be an administrative thing? Is this something faculty have to take on? And so no one really says like, oh, it's my thing. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of nonprofits that operate in this space of trying to like come do a campus takeover. Maybe we'll like control your social media. We'll try to do outreach. There's not a uniform approach to this. So everyone's sort of figuring it out as best they can. It's not to say that higher ed shouldn't do this, but by the time we get them, they're already voting eligible. And so we're playing just so much catch up. There are some states that are making arguments that you should require something like an intro to US government as a college level class. I don't disagree with that because I know that if students get through US high schools and they don't opt into a political science programs, they're often not going to get anything that looks like any routinized instruction in how to participate. And so I think stuff like that is good. But again, there's got to be a prioritization of teachers available to teach it and people who like understand the system itself because we don't really have a ton of people who do that now.
We have a question about the concept of civic virtue that the founder spoke about, and whether that's a concept that's still out there. Do people, is that something that, do you have an understanding of it? Is it taught to our students what civic virtue might mean?
So here's what I'll say about this. I can't tell you it's not taught. I can't tell you that it's taught everywhere because it really is a system that is 50 factorial of how many schools there are and how we're doing this. But I will say one of the ways that we tend to teach civics, especially in the younger grades, is we teach it as if, 250 years ago, some really smart guys got together and they made this beautiful document. Aren't we all so lucky to be here? And so a lot of the times our students think about it as like spectators of history, which is like, ooh, I have to remember some names, I have to remember some dates, there's some key places, maybe some battles. And they don't really necessarily always learn it as like, this is something that I have to do. This is something that's good. I should be community oriented, or I should be someone who cares about who's representing me, whatever. It's not to say that these concepts aren't taught, but they're not ubiquitous. Oftentimes we focus on like the people, the places, the dates, and it's not clear to me that that's actually the most helpful thing for our students to understand our system today because they're not just spectators, they are participants, but we don't really gear them for that, despite the fact that different schools do it differently.
You talked before about how everybody should read the Constitution at least once. I agree. But we had a question here, which is maybe relevant. It was about the Federalist Papers, but maybe it can go for both. That this is 18th century language, and maybe it's arcane and difficult for people to access. Are you aware of efforts to sort of write the Federalist Papers or present the Constitution sort of in plain 21st century language to help people access the concepts?
Yeah, thank you for this question, Paul. I think this is a great question. I mean, I think we see popular media sort of updates in the form of Hamilton, where it's like, let's try to get to some of these concepts in ways that can connect with young people. And I know there's a fleet of people doing sorts of, let me just break this down to you. I think one of the challenges is we really do not have curricular time to go through this. Like most of your children are not going to read the Federalist Papers, whether it's in high school or in college. It's just like not what gets stressed. And so if we were to have like a simpler version, that would be better, but it's not clear that we're going to build in curricular time. So I don't think it's so much, like, oh, we just don't have these pieces that we can give to them. I really think it's a prioritization level. And until we change that, it doesn't really matter if it's arcane or not. On the Constitution, I'll say, I don't think that language is that hard. I really don't. I mean, I teach the Constitution every year. I just finished the Bill of Rights yesterday with my students, and none of this is that difficult. It does take like turning on their brain a little bit more, but none of it is impossible for them to understand.
Speaking about the Bill of Rights, I don't have it in front of me, but I know I've seen headlines about polls of young people and their support for concepts such as free speech slipping. So that's not a question about the ignorance of civics, but maybe a question about students, young people, kind of no longer sharing some civic values that I think Americans have long thought important. Is that the same problem or a different problem?
I think they're related, but my guess on that is that's probably about us not having an adversary to like rally against. Like we don't have like a
Hmm.
rising USSR or a rising China that we sort of agree on as an adversary that doesn't respect these principles. And I think it's also really hard if we think about our social media landscape that tends to have like more TikTok than anything else for young people, where we sort of think like, oh, this is this bastion of free speech, but really it seems to be sort of like a mechanism of a country that doesn't really want free speech to be out there. It's sort of like a flood the speech with other sorts of things. And so I think our kids today, understandably, are a little bit confused about this in ways that we wouldn't have been because they just don't have these sort of counterpoints or adversaries to sort of compare themselves to. And instead, their media landscape is really like sort of flooded with people who you or I might have grown up being like afraid of having too much power, or our grandparents certainly would have.
If you as a parent are feeling demoralized by the state of our politics, you think you talk about that candidly with your kids, or you try to protect them from that and give them a more hopeful gloss on the state of things and the, I guess, near-term future for the country?
So, something that I'll say is when I was talking to people out in New York City about politics, something that I repeatedly heard was sort of this idea of like, I'm really frustrated with politics. I don't like how it's going. We're on this like ship and it's like ugh, going everywhere and it doesn't make any sense. And I think sometimes we get wrapped up in seeing ourselves as sort of like passengers on democracy, when in reality, we are the crew. Like we are the ones who steer the ship. We are the adults in the room. We're the ones who get to make these choices now. So if we're frustrated or overwhelmed about this, and we don't want our kids to be frustrated or overwhelmed, I think the best thing to do is level with them and be like, look, our politics doesn't really function the way that I want it to function right now. It certainly doesn't feel the way I want it to feel. But there's only an opportunity to make it better by sort of leaning in and doing more and showing them the value of that. Because I truly think that that is a way out. And especially if you look at local and state politics, federal politics are hard. Federal politics take a lot of money. There's a lot of distance. There's a lot of moving actions. But if we think about things like happening at our state and local level, they turn on way fewer voters. They turn on much less activism. And even in New York City, which is, a big municipal government, you used to not be able to have strollers on our buses unless they were folded up. And then there was one woman, Danielle Avasar, on the Upper East Side that was like, well, this shouldn't be. And it took her a year to get a law change where now you can have strollers on buses. And sure, she had other people who joined with her, but it was just like one lady saying, like, I don't think this is how it should be. And there's plenty of stories like that at the state and local level that don't have to be hopeless, that instead are actually full of opportunity if we're willing to sort of like see ourselves as crew members, not just passengers.
Did doing this work change you at all and how you think about either parenting or how you think about these problems as an academic?
I think it's definitely changed me. I think it's something where I came into higher ed thinking that my students were going to be far more prepared than they were, and then sort of being let down. I mean, like, how is this that you guys got into this school and you don't know this? And then I have a lot more empathy because I understand the pressures that our students have in K through 12 are not pointing them towards understanding government. It's pointing them towards like science, math, and English and optimizing for that. I think in my parenting, something that has changed is I'm just so much more willing to have these conversations out because I know that she's not going to get them elsewhere. And I'll give you a little example that when the Dobbs decision came down, my daughter was 12, oh, she was 10 then, and she asked me what an abortion was. And it was like a question we hadn't broached in our house. Like she knew what pregnancy was, she knew like how babies were made, but we hadn't talked about abortion. And I thought, maybe I could say, I'll tell you when you're older. Maybe I could like try to make something up or gloss over it. But I knew that if I didn't shoot straight with her, she'd just go to her room and be like, hey, Alexa, what's an abortion? And I was like, okay, well, I don't really want her to be the one who does this. And so it has changed my parenting to let me know that, like, if they come to me with something, I'm going to answer. I'm not going to say I know everything. And when I don't know where I'm at, I'll say, oh, you know what? I don't know that. Let's go learn a little bit more. And I think that's sort of the best thing that we can do for our kids is to show them that, like, we don't know everything. We are learning more. And guess what? They're going to do the same as they navigate life. And how lucky for them to have a model of how to do that instead of just trying to figure it out on their own.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much. What has been kind of the reactions you've gotten, I guess, to the book? Have they surprised you? Have they been positive?
Mostly they've been positive. I'll tell you something that's been not super positive is oftentimes I'll like do this sort of work with PTAs or parent groups or salons, sometimes with lawyers, sometimes with kids themselves. And what I hear more from moms than for dads is they'll say something like, I just feel I don't know enough about this subject. So I don't want to lead my kids astray or I don't want to like unduly influence them. And I think that's an inhibiting feeling that actually doesn't help anyone because we do know enough in some way. Like if we're eligible to participate, we're eligible to figure more things out. And so I think if I can give people a takeaway, it's like, yeah, you might not feel like you know that much right now, but that doesn't mean you can't learn more. And that doesn't mean that you're not the most valuable person for your child to look to for how to learn more. And so I really encourage people to get over that feeling of like, I didn't learn it that well, or I don't like to follow politics, or it's not conversations I like to have. It's like, well, guess what? They're unavoidable. Your kids are going to have them. It's going to come to them. They're going to confront these realities. And so instead of just being afraid of this, let's take it on because it can only go up from here. We all know that things aren't feeling very good. It can only feel better if we put more attention on it.
That's fantastic. I think that's probably a good place to start wrapping up our conversation. But if there's anything that I didn't ask you about that you'd like to point out, I would love to give you the opportunity to make any final points or closing thoughts that you have.
No, I think that's really where I like to end it is like we have to take this on. And I'm so thankful that people are here being willing to do that work with you as a part of your society. And I'm glad that I got to spend some time with you all to talk about the thing that I care about dearly, which is making sure our young people understand the systems that they're going to grow up into because they're the ones who are going to wield power in the future.
Well, I really am grateful to you for writing this book. I mean, I think one of the kind of the core animating ideas of the society is that the Constitution, the rule of law, and the system that we're blessed to enjoy uh, cannot be left just to the lawyers and the courts. It's a patrimony, it's an inheritance that we all need to engage in and defend to benefit from its blessings. So thank you again, Lindsey. I really appreciate it. Again, the book is How to Raise a Citizen. I've seen a few comments already of people saying they're going to go out and buy it. I encourage them to. It's great. And thank you so much for being with us here today. And just in closing, I'll remind everybody that this was recorded. It will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, which I encourage you to follow as well. We're also on Twitter and LinkedIn. We are a membership society. If you're not a member yet, please consider joining. If you are a member, thank you. Encourage friends and family members to join as well. Hopefully, I will see many of you in person at our Rule of Law Summit, November 13th, here in Washington, D.C. Thank you again, and thanks to Professor Cormack for being so generous with her time and for writing this marvelous book. Thank you
Thank
all.
you.